Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The throne room felt colder now. Carlos sat in his father's place, the empty seat behind the council table, vast and intimidating. His fingers drummed absent-mindedly on the armrest, eyes distant, replaying the events of the last few weeks. His father, King Iman, had been murdered. The once thriving kingdom of Ella was in turmoil, nobles fighting for control, the people uncertain about their future. All eyes were on Carlos, but he felt unworthy of their expectation. His heart ached with the weight of grief and guilt. He should then been there, should then protected his father. His failure gnawed at him day and night, and every time he closed his eyes, the image of his father's bloody body flashed before him. You cannot let revenge consume you, Your Highness. Carlos looked up, startled from his thoughts. Alistair, his father, his closest advisor, stood at the entrance to the throne room, his graying beard and kind eyes betraying the weariness of years spent in the king's house service. I am not seeking revenge, Carlos replied, though his voice lacked conviction. I am seeking justice. Alistair raised a brow, but said nothing. He need to. They both knew what truly weighed on Carlos' mind. Justice and revenge had blurred together ever since the assassination, and Carlos' heart craved vengeance more than he cared to admit. There's nothing more you could have done, Alistair said gently, walking further into the room. King Ammon says ... It wasn't your fault. Carlos clenched his jaw, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the armrest of the throne. But it should have been Alistair. I should have been there to protect him. Alistair sighed and placed a hand on the young prince's shoulder. What's said done is done. We can only move forward. Carlos didn't try to respond, his thoughts already drifting elsewhere. He needed more than empty words. The murderer was still out there, lurking in the shadows, plotting the kingdom's demise, and Carlos was powerless to stop them. Or so he thought. That night, restless and unable to sleep, Carlos wandered the darkened halls of the castle. His feet carried him deeper into the undercroft where the crypts of his ancestors lay. He had come here often since his father's death, seeking comfort in the cold, silent presence of the past. It was said that the dead could offer wisdom, and Carlos hoped for guidance. But tonight, something felt different. The torchlight flickered erratically as he passed the stone sarcophagi, shadows dancing along the ancient wall. Carlos had never ventured this far down before, and the air grew heavier, the silence thicker. His footsteps echoed loudly in the confined space, each one driving him deeper into a place that seemed almost forbidden. At the end of the passageway, a small, inconspicuous door caught his attention. It was weathered with age, nearly hidden beneath layers of dust and cobweb. Carlos had never noticed it before, but something about it drew him in. Without thinking, he pushed the door open. Inside was a chamber larger than he had expected. It was dimly lit by a faint blue glow emanating from the far end, where an ancient sword stood embedded in stone. The blade shimmered with a strange, otherworldly light, casting eerie shadows across the room. Intricate runes were etched along its length, pulsating faintly as if alive. Carlos stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The sword seemed to call to him, its presence undeniable. He could almost hear a whisper, faint and elusive, just beyond the edge of his perception. The shadow blade. He had heard stories of the blade growing up, tales of its immense power, how it had been wielded by the greatest of his ancestors in times of need. But it was cursed. They said its power came at a cost, corrupting the hearts of those who wielded it, driving them to madness. Carlos hesitated, but the pull of the sword was strong, too strong to resist. His fingers brushed against the hilt, and in that moment a surge of energy shot through him, cold and sharp. The room seemed to tilt around him, the shadows deepening as the sword came free from the stone with an unnatural ease. The whispers grew louder, now swirling around him like a storm. I can give you power. I can help you avenge your father. Carlos' grip tightened on the hilt, his breath shallow. The sword felt heavy in his hand, but at the same time, it was as if it was made for him. His blood sang with its power, and the ache of helplessness that had plagued him for weeks faded away, replaced by something darker, something fierce. He raised the blade, watching as the blue glow intensified, illuminating the crypt in an unholy light. For the first time since his father, Carlos felt in control. He could do it. He could find the people responsible for the assassination, and he could destroy them. But at what cost? A sudden voice broke through the haze of power swirling in his mind. Your Highness. Carlos whipped around, his heart skipping a beat. Alistair stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with shock as they fell upon the shadow blade in Carlos' hand. What have you done? Alistair whispered, his voice trembling. Carlos faltered, the weight of the sword suddenly pressing down on him. I found it. Alistair stepped forward, his expression dark. You were never supposed to touch that sword. It's accursed. It will destroy you. Carlos shook his head, the power coursing through him too intoxicating to let go. No, it can help me. It can help me avenge my father. Avenge him, Alistair's voice rose with urgency. This sword doesn't just offer power, Carlos. It takes everything in return, your mind, your soul. It will consume you. Carlos stared at the blade, his reflection distorted in its dark surface. For a moment, doubt flickered in his mind, but then the whispers returned, louder than before. They will fear you. You can end this war before it begins. You can become the king this kingdom needs. I can control it, Carlos said, more to himself than to Alistair. Have to. Alistair's face fell. Carlos, please don't do this. But Carlos was already turning away, the whispers of the sword drowning out Alistair's voice. And he sheathed the blade at his side and strode past his mentor, his heart pounding with purpose. Days passed, and the kingdom stirred with whispers of their young prince wielding the fabled shadow blade. Some spoke of hope of the prince's newfound strength. Others, particularly those closest to the court, feared what the sword represented. Carlos trained day and night with the sword, his skills sharpening at an unnerving rate. With each swing, he felt the blade's dark power seep deeper into his soul, merging with his every thought. He felt invincible, unstoppable, but there was a cost. Shadows clung to him more than before, his once bright demeanor dimming, his temper shortening. The whispers of the sword became louder, more insistent, and as they did, Carlos' thoughts grew darker. He began to view everyone around him as potential threats, obstacles in his path to vengeance. Even Isabella, his childhood friend, could see the change in him. She approached him one evening in the gardens, where they used to meet as children. The sun had set, and the air was cool, but there was a tension between them that hadn't been there before. Carlos, she began, her voice soft but filled with concern. I've heard the rumors about the sword. Is it true? Carlos turned to her, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of the shadow blade. What of it? Isabella stepped closer, her eyes searching his face, Siri changing. Yuri, not the same person I've always known. That sword, it's dangerous. You know the stories. It corrupts anyone who uses it. Carlos frowned, the whispers urging him to dismiss her words, to push her away. But there was still a part of him that cared, that wanted to listen. I have to do this, Isabella. I have to protect the kingdom. Protect the kingdom. She shook her head, her voice trembling with emotion. Or avenge your father. You don't have to carry this burden alone. There are other ways. There are no other ways. Carlos snapped, his hand tightening around the sword. Hilt. Isabella flinched at the sudden outburst, and Carlos immediately regretted it. But the sword and its influence was too strong. Its pull too overwhelming. I am sorry, he muttered, turning away from her, but this is my choice. Isabella stood in silence for a moment, her heart breaking for the friend she had known for so long. Carlos, please don't let this destroy you. Carlos didn't respond. He couldn't tell the whispers had already drowned out her voice. Carlos didn't turn back to look at Isabella as he walked away, the weight of the shadow blade growing heavier at his side. His mind was a tempest of thoughts, some his own, others whispered by the sword. The line between the two blurred more with each passing day. As he strode through the castle corridors, shadows seemed to curl around his feet, following him wherever he went. The power of the sword was intoxicating, and with every breath, he felt it seep further into his bones. The throne room doors loomed ahead, and as he pushed them open, a wave of unease swept over the guards stationed nearby. They whispered among themselves, casting uneasy glances at the young prince. He had become a figure of both awe and fear, his presence unsettling to those who once served him without question. Carlos barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by one thing, the dark sorcerer. The name alone made his blood boil. The man responsible for his father's death still walked free, still plotted in the shadows. Carlos clenched his fists as he crossed the vast chamber, every step echoing through the empty hall. His father's son's death would not go unpunished. The shadow blade pulsed at his side, as if in agreement, its cold whisper, promising him the strength to exact the revenge he so desperately craved. "You've summoned me, your highness." Carlos turned to see Alistair standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. The old man had always been able to hide his emotions well, but Carlos could sense the unease in him. Alistair had always feared the sword, feared what it would do to Carlos. "I am going after him," Carlos said, his voice firm. "Or the dark sorcerer. I will find him, and I will end him." Alistair took a slow step forward, his eyes flickering briefly to the sword. "Dear Highness, I must urge you to reconsider this path." "This is the only path left," Carlos interrupted, his tone sharper than he intended. "You said it yourself, Alistair. My father's death can go unpunished. The sorcerer is out there waiting for his next move. I can sit idly by and watch him destroy everything my father built." Alistair's brow furrowed. "But at what cost? You've seen what the shadow blade does. It's already—" "I control it," Carlos said coldly, though deep down, he wasn't entirely sure if that was true. "I will not let it control me. This kingdom needs a strong leader now more than ever." There was a heavy silence between them. Alistair's gaze lingered on the prince, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Tyra, your father would not have wanted this for you, Carlos." Carlos looked away, his jaw tightening. "Tyra, my father is dead." Without waiting for a response, Carlos turned and strode from the throne room. The decision had been made. He would hunt the sorcerer down, and nothing would stop him. The whispers of the sword urged him forward, feeding his anger, his thirst for revenge. And for the first time in weeks, Carlos felt like he had a purpose. The journey to the sorcerer's lair was long and treacherous. Carlos rode through the dense forests and barren fields, his only company the eerie glow of the shadow blade at his side. The sword had become almost a living thing, its whispers growing louder with each mile, pushing him toward his inevitable confrontation. The closer he got, the darker the world seemed to become. The trees twisted unnaturally, their branches like claws reaching toward the sky. Shadows moved where there should be none, and Carlos could feel the weight of the sorcerer's magic pressing down on him like a heavy fog. But he didn't falter. The sword set a power course through him, keeping him sharp, focused. When he finally reached the sorcerer's stronghold, it was nothing like he had imagined. A crumbling fortress hidden deep within the mountains, its once grand towers now shattered and overgrown with ivy. The gates stood ajar as if inviting him in. Carlos dismounted his horse, drawing the shadow blade from its sheath. The sword hummed in his hand, its dark energy pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He could feel the sorcerer's presence inside waiting for him. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. With a determined stride, Carlos entered the fortress, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. The air was thick with the stench of decay and old magic, the walls lined with faded tapestries that told stories of ancient battles, long forgotten. But Carlos had no interest in history. His only focus was the man who had taken everything from him. The sorcerer was waiting in the main hall, seated on a dilapidated throne of stone. His black robes hung loosely from his thin frame, his eyes glowing with a sickly green light. He smiled as Carlos approached, his voice like a hiss of smoke. "Gira, the young prince, I've been expecting you." Carlos gripped the sword tighter, his anger bubbling to the surface. "Eric, you killed my father." The sorcerer chuckled, rising slowly from the throne. "I know I did much more than that, boy. I set in motion events that will change the very fabric of this kingdom. Your father was merely the first piece to fall." Carlos' blood boiled, the whispers of the sword urging him to strike, to end the sorcerer where he stood. But he hesitated. Something about the sorcerer's calm demeanor unsettled him. "You are nothing but a coward," Carlos spat, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You're hiding in the shadows while others do your bidding." The sorcerer's smile widened. "And yet here you are, wielding a blade forged in those very same shadows. How does it feel, boy? How does it feel to know that the power you crave will be your undoing?" Carlos' heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the sword suddenly heavier in his hand. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, telling him to strike, to kill, to end this once and for all. But there was something else now, something beneath the whispers, a faint warning that gnawed at the edges of his mind. "I am not like you," Carlos said, his voice low but firm. "I control the sword, it doesn't control me." The sorcerer laughed a hollow, mocking sound. "Oh, but it does, you just haven't realized it yet." With a snarl, Carlos lunged forward, the shadow blade gleaming as it sliced through the air. The sorcerer barely moved, his hand raised in a casual gesture. The blast of dark energy erupted from his palm, slamming into Carlos and sending him flying backward into the stone wall. Carlos gasped, the air knocked from his lungs as he hit the ground hard. The sword clattered beside him, its glow flickering for a moment. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to his feet, grabbing the sword once more. The sorcerer approached slowly, his eyes glowing brighter with each step. "You are nothing but a pawn, Carlos, a pawn in a game. You don't even understand. Your father knew that in the end that's why he died, and you will meet the same fate." Carlos gritted his teeth, the words cutting deep, but he wouldn't give it. Not now, not after everything. He raised the sword again, the whispers now screaming in his ears. "Kill him," and then, with a roar, Carlos charged, swinging the shadow blade with all his strength. This time, the sorcerer didn't move. The blade connected, cutting through the sorcerer's cell, robes his flesh, his very soul. For a brief moment, the sorceress' eyes widened in shock, the glow fading as his body crumpled to the ground. Carlos stood over him, panting, his heart racing. The sorcerer was dead. It was over. But as he looked down at the body, a cold realization crept over him. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they had grown louder, more demanding. The sword pulsed in his hand, feeding on the death, on the power it had claimed. And in that moment, Carlos understood the sorcerer had been right. The sword had already begun to consume him. He could feel its darkness crawling through his veins, poisoning his thoughts, twisting his mind. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The ride back to the castle was a blur. Carlos' body ached, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. The shadow blade rested at his side, its whispers ever present, never allowing him a moment of peace. He had avenged his father, but at what cost? When he returned to the castle, the kingdom was waiting for him, expecting their victorious prince to lead them. But Carlos was no longer the man they had once known. The darkness had taken root, and no matter how hard he fought, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it consumed him completely. Isabella met him at the gates, her face pale with worry. "Carlos, what happened?" Carlos didn't answer. He couldn't tell. All he could do was look at her, the one person who still believed in him, and wonder how much longer he could hold on before he lost himself entirely.